Heat check. Basketball, basketball, college. Basketball, basketball, college. Oh, is that time already? Whoa.
Welcome into another episode of Heat Check Hangout, your number one source for all things basketball, basketball college. I'm your host, Brian Rauf, joined as always by my co-host, Connor Hope. Today we're starting our conference preview series with the Big 12. If you can see my t-shirt, we are representing the now defending national champion, Kansas Jayhawks. It's been a good offseason for Kansas, I guess you could say, in a series where Kansas hasn't had too many good off seasons.
Yeah.
The FBI investigation is still looming over them, potential punishment coming from that. But this is a program that is now coming back off of a national championship, so it's hard not to bask in that glow if you're a Jayhawk fan. Connor, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I mean, it's coming up. I think we have 9 or 10 weeks of previews. We're previewing the 6 power conferences. We're lumping the next 4 mid-major conferences, and then we're going to have a big mid-major, kind of best of the rest preview. So that gives us 9-10 weeks until the start of the basketball season, and starting off with the conference of the defending national championship champions, I should say, is I think a good place to start. But I'm excited. 10 weeks is not a long time.
We're getting down into it. I think the official countdown, saw Matt Norlander tweeted out, it was like 68 days or 69 days away from the start of the season, which nice. Also, it's much closer than I think people think it is with college football getting underway and everything like that. But we're just about there, and conference preview season it kicks that off, at least for us, and hopefully for you too as well. So let's talk about Kansas. Because while they are the defending national champions, there is a lot to replace there. Ochai Agbaji, gone. David McCormack, gone. Remy Martin, gone. There is some key pieces back for this team. You look at Jalen Wilson, DeJuan Harris, started most of last season as the point guard. Highly rated freshman class. Bill Self's still the coach. Kansas still Kansas. They still have an abundance of talent. But it's unproven, and they're going to look different this year. Does that change your expectations for them at all?
I mean, I think your expectations have to drop a little bit, right? I'm not looking at Kansas as a top half favorite, right? Like, if you're looking at the teams that can compete for a national championship, Kansas for me is probably closer to the bottom of that short list than the top. But look, you've still got Harris and Wilson. Kevin McCullough is coming in. He has experience in the tournament. He has experience in the Big 12. Probably going to play mostly on the wing, but can also handle the ball and be a point wing for them. And I wouldn't count out someone like Joseph Yesufu, who transferred in from Drake last year, didn't really play a ton of minutes, but has the ability, I think, to step into a backup point guard role behind Harris, behind McCullough, and really be serviceable in the Big 12 and in the NCAA tournament. But I've got some concerns. 3-point shooting being the primary one outside of Grady Dick and what he can do stepping into a D1 shooter's role. There's not much there behind him. That I think I trust. What about you? What about you in terms of your concerns other than just the experience?
My biggest question is who's the guy, right? It was very clearly Ochai Agbaji last year. David McCormack had been that guy when he was on at times the last 2 years. This team doesn't necessarily have that. Jalen Wilson, there's some talk about potentially he could be, which he might be, but we haven't seen it. He's been a very good player, but not necessarily a great player to this point in his career. Kevin McCullough, coming over from Texas Tech, is a great transfer pickup for the Jayhawks, particularly in conference. But he also hasn't been that guy at Texas Tech. He's a very good starting caliber player, particularly on the defensive end, but he's not going to go get you 20 or get you a bucket when you need it. Right, he's not that kind of guy. Some of the freshmen could develop into that potentially, but none of them are clear slam dunk. I'm the guy as soon as I step on campus, kind of players. Kansas's best teams have that guy. They have an Ochai Agbaji. They have a Frank Mason. They had a Devontae Graham when he stepped into that when Frank Mason left. This team doesn't necessarily have that. Shooting is a concern. I think the interior is a concern. Go from Azubuike to McCormack to now a question mark there. Again, there's talent on this roster, so I don't have a problem thinking that somebody will step up down low, particularly with the way Bill Self develops big men. But there's a question as to who it is. Or do they go small? Could KJ Adams come in, play some 5 with his athleticism and strength? Kansas then goes small and play faster. Like, there's some options there that are just unknown, that we don't know. Interior is a question. 3-point shooting is a question. But I think the lingering question that may determine their ceiling, I think, has more to do with who becomes that guy.
Right.
And if somebody can be that guy.
Yeah, and we've seen the lack of having that guy hurt teams in the past, right? I think the fact that, last year we were a Gonzaga podcast, and Gonzaga last year didn't really have that guy. You had Drew Timme who could take over on the interior, but you didn't have that guy who can create his own shot. I'm not going to trust a freshman in Grady Dick to do that, or MJ Rice. I don't really trust DeJuan Harris or Yesufu to do that. So then it does leave McCullough, who hasn't been that guy, or Jalen Wilson, who's been more inconsistent than you would like out of someone who's taking on the responsibility of pushing 15 to 20 points a game on a consistent basis. So, look, they're still a top 10 team to me, I think, in the country. They still have plenty of good pieces, and I think in a year or two, if some pieces of this core stick together, obviously they're going to lose McCullough after this year. They might lose Wilson after this year and maybe a couple of the freshmen. But I think they have a core that's strong enough where in a year or two they'll be right back where they were competing for a national championship. But I don't know if this is that year.
I'm with you. I have them preseason top 10 as well. I think the overall talent level is fairly high. That coupled with Bill Self as a coach, Kansas always has a pretty high floor, I think. The difference is going to be finding that guy. And we got a question on Twitter from Carl Heiser basically asking, can Jalen Wilson be that guy? If he can't, that's where Kansas is going to run into some problems, I think, because Wilson is the only one, I think, right now capable of potentially becoming that guy. He was Kansas's best player for a bit 2 years ago, but that was more by default. Kansas was really struggling, and he was just their leading scorer. He had a good couple weeks, but he wasn't like that guy take over best player in the conference kind of good that you typically see those guys be at Kansas. So, Carl, he can. I don't really foresee it. But if Kansas is going to make it back to a Final Four, he's going to have to be.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The other Big 12 team that's in the Final Four discussion, at least preseason, is Baylor. They were national champion 2 years ago, 1 seed last year before being upset by UNC in the second round. There were some injuries that played a role. They got a lot of guys back too. Lose Matthew Meyer to Illinois, but a lot of the core group is back from last year's team. Is it a 2-team race at the top here? Should Baylor be considered the favorite ahead of Kansas?
I think so. I think the core they keep together is stronger than Kansas is. I think Keontae George is the best freshman at either of the two schools, or projects to be the best freshman at either of the two schools. They don't have the question marks really in the front court. You've got Flo Thamba, who's probably going to be the starting center until Chamo Chachua can come back from his injury. You've got Jalen Bridges and Caleb Lohner also playing the 4. So the front court has very few questions. Flagler and Cryer, pretty solid, experienced guard group alongside George. Langston Love comes in as another pretty solid freshman. So I like the group that Baylor has. And look, if you're, I think if you're looking at it right now, and granted we're only I guess, 2.5 years into the 2020s. But Baylor has a pretty good head start as being the best program of the 2020s. So I'm gonna probably say, and this might be projecting what we'll discuss later, which is our overall rankings. But I'm gonna say that Baylor is my clear number one. And I think I've been clear about this from the start. I said there's 3 teams at the top of the country, and Baylor is that clear 4th team for me, ahead of Kansas. So, I think that Baylor is a stronger unit. They have better shooters, better experience, a better star freshman. And I think, whether it's Flagler or George, who ends up being that guy at the end of games, you can't really go wrong there.
I have talked the last couple of weeks, I think, about how I have questions about Baylor's guards and if they are actually great. I still hold true those questions as to if Flagler and Cryer are great top-end point guards in the country. I have no doubt they're very good. Baylor's going to be fine. This Baylor team is going to be very, very good. I want to make that clear because I feel like I've been bashing Baylor the last couple of times. I've talked about them, and it's not. It's just that might come into play when you're splitting hairs at the top of standings, looking at Final Four teams, looking at legitimate national title favorites, right? That's when that comes into play. But looking at Baylor as a whole, Big 12, there isn't a lot to not like about this team. They had a real question at the 4 spot after Chachua's knee injury. They didn't really have a guy to come in and replace him there. They went out in the portal and addressed that need. So you have options there now. You still have Flo Thamba inside. You have those backcourt guys that I mentioned. This is a good group. If Keontae George produces anywhere near what we expect him to, which from what we've seen this summer, I think his expectations are pretty high, and they should be. Baylor, it will be the best team in this conference.
Yeah,
there might be some variances with the youth, some of the injuries, but they're the most well-rounded team, I think, in this conference. Yep. Talk about Kansas's floor being very high. I think Baylor's floor is even higher. This is going to be a really good top 10 team pretty much all season long.
Yeah, I mean, they're that team, and we'll discuss it when we talk about some of the teams later. Their defense sets that floor pretty high, and Kansas has a great defense as well, but it's tough to find a better defense at a school where offense is also strong than with Baylor, right? You've got good defenses in Virginia, and we'll talk about Texas Tech and San Diego State, but the offense always seems to take a dip. Past couple of years, Baylor's had a pretty solid defense, and their offense has also met the challenge, and I think that's going to be the same this year. Absolutely.
The next group, I want to talk about the other Texas teams. I think all 3 of those, Texas, Texas Tech, and TCU, have some interesting storylines going into the season. You go to Texas Tech, second year Mark Adams, a little bit more roster turnover, some more transfer portal additions, but some questions about how good they'll be. Texas, Chris Beard, second season. Not the same hype around them, but more returning experience than they had a year ago. And then TCU, who is building to what appears to be perhaps the breakout season of the Jamie Dixon era, where if a foul was correctly called on Mike Miles at the end of that game against Arizona, we're talking about a Sweet 16 team. But again, I'm not going to belabor that point since I picked TCU to win that game and I should have been right. But anyway, these 3 teams are all interesting to me because they're all in that top 20 kind of range nationally. All of them have high expectations, but all of them also have legitimate reasons why you could point to them as being overrated.
Right.
Of these 3, who do you trust the most?
I trust Mark Adams the most. The roster might not be there at the spot where it was last year. But I do think that it is a spot where you have got Davion Harmon, who isn't a top-end offensive weapon, but can still disrupt the ball on the perimeter.
But he thinks he is sometimes, and that's an issue.
It can be a problem, and I think if it were Beard, it would be more of a problem because we saw it become a problem with Mac McClung when he was there. I think if he starts becoming that primary scoring option, then you might run into some issues. Again, I talked about it with Baylor. I said we would talk about it with Texas Tech. The defense, though, Harmon coming in, pretty solid perimeter defender. Fardaws Aimaq coming in, really good interior defender. Can he step up into the Big 12 and do the same thing? Who knows? But I think the two of them are good enough defensively where you take the lumps that they might give you offensively. Aimaq might not shoot from three at the same rate he did when he was in the WAC. Davion Harmon can have his issues offensively. Heck, even Kerwin Walton's not the most efficient scorer in the world. But, I think you've got those. You've got Daniel Bacho, who is, again, not a great offensive weapon, but he's consistent enough where I think it's not a big issue. And the freshman coming in. And DeMaurian Williams, I think, is a really solid shooter. If that's all he is, that's great for this team. Yeah. So I do worry about the offense, but I think of all the three teams that we're going to talk about in this group, Texas Tech is the least vulnerable to bad offense, if that makes sense.
It does. See, this is going to be talking out of both sides of my mouth here. I think Texas probably has the highest floor of this group simply because they have, I think, more talent returning than the rest of them. But I also don't know how high their floor is. Like, I'm done getting on this Texas Chris Beard roller coaster where we hype them up in the preseason and they're fine. Not great, but just fine. And then go out in the NCAA tournament in a range where a fine team goes out, right? I still have hope Marcus Carr can become the guy he was his last year at Minnesota in Texas because I think he, on the surface, fits Chris Beard's offensive system so well. He is a great ISO scorer. He is great in pick and rolls. That's what he did so well at Minnesota. It just didn't work last year at Texas. I still have some hope that happens. Timmy Allen was a really good player for Texas. He's back. I think we'll see hopefully more synergy with him and Carr their second season playing together. But you can throw Christian Bishop in there too. But I don't trust it. I think their floor will be what we saw last year, which again was a borderline top 25 fine team. Texas Tech's probably in that same range just because of the defense, like you mentioned. TCU to me has the highest upside, and it's why I like them the most of this group. They were a young team last year, bring pretty much everybody back. You could make a very easy case that Mike Miles is the best point guard in this conference. He has to become more efficient, and he's not a good shooter. But he is somebody who can create for himself, create for others, wants the ball, the game on the line, solid defender. You would expect any Jamie Dixon team or player to be a solid defender. He fits that mold as well. Anytime you have the best point guard in the conference, you have a legitimate shot. And Miles is one of the best point guards in the country, let alone the conference. The swing point for me on Texas Tech is going to be Eddie Lampkin. Because when he is on the court...
Texas Christian. TCU, not Texas Tech.
TCU, yes, my apologies. There are too many Texases flying around here. The biggest swing point for TCU for me is Eddie Lampkin. When he's on the court and engaged, he's awesome. And we saw in that Arizona game where he told 7'1" Christian Koloko he was too small because he was. He couldn't handle anything Lampkin was doing. But Lampkin needs to stay on the court. He needs to get in better shape. He needs to stay out of foul trouble. He needs to be able to move his feet. All those things are things that they focus on working on with him this offseason. If he comes in and is able to maintain, not the level he showed at the Arizona game, because that was perhaps a career game for him, but if he can get to a spot where he is on the court for 25 minutes a game, he can average 15 and 7, 15 and 8, and be that dominant force for a team that likes to play at a slower pace. If he can be that dominant interior presence, then I think we're looking at TCU potentially jumping up to that Kansas Baylor tier. But that's a lot. They have to shoot the ball better too, be a little bit more efficient on the offensive end. Things that you think would come with more experience. But I'm very, very high on the ceiling from this TCU team.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think TCU has the highest ceiling. Look, they're probably the most experienced team of these three. Eddie Lampkin is the only one that's going to get significant minutes for them that is not a junior or a senior. He's expecting another jump, but on paper, you've got Mike Miles, who's a junior. Damian Bowe is a senior. Chuck O'Bannon's a redshirt senior. Emmanuel Miller is a senior. Micah Peavy is a junior. Rondell Walker, who comes in from Oklahoma State, who basically just fills the role left by Francisco Farabello in terms of like the production that he'll give them, is a junior. Shahada Wells is a senior. So you've got really experienced guys. None of these three teams shoots the ball well. Like Texas could shoot it better, but Christian Bishop isn't really a huge threat to be a stretch for. He's a 33% shooter, so he is a stretch by definition, but not in the same realm as maybe an AMAC might be. Dylan Daisu shoots under 20%. Timmy Allen shoots under 30%. Marcus Carr can shoot better. He's just inconsistent. My question with Texas, and it's the reason why I'm a little bit lower on their floor, is just, if Tyrese Hunter and Marcus Carr work well together, that's gold. If they
Absolutely.
don't,
I mean, that's defensively, that's incredible.
If they don't offensively work well together, which is a factor because they are both the ball dominant guards, and if they don't work well together, like the bottom of this Texas team could just fall out. Similar to what it did early on last year, where the guard play I feel like was what was causing this Texas rift, is that none of the guards seemed to gel early on in the season. And you've got two guys, Marcus Carr, who's in his last year of eligibility, and Tyrese Hunter, who's looking to jump into the NBA. Both of them want the ball in their hands every possession, and that's not going to be possible a lot of times. So it'll just be interesting to see how two relatively inefficient scoring guards who like to have the ball in their hand, distribute well, work together, because I think 2 point guard lineups can be brilliant. But you also see a lot of 2 point guard lineups kind of fall flat because of that.
Speaking of teams who don't shoot the ball well, should we talk about Iowa State and Oklahoma State right now?
Fine by me.
Iowa State may have been the most unlikely Sweet 16 team last year, including St. Peter's. Not really, but just the standpoint of how atrocious their offense was. The fact that they still made it to the Sweet 16 with how bad that offense was incredible. And some of it just was byproduct of who they got matched up with and the level of defense they're able to play. But you now take a team that was among the worst teams in the entire country in offensive efficiency. Take your top two scorers, and Isaiah Brockington and Tyrese Hunter, who's now at Texas. I think Iowa State will be fine because of what they bring defensively, particularly with Osun Osuni coming in from St. Bonaventure, giving them perhaps the nation's best shot blocker. But offensively, woof. It might be worse than last year, which is saying a lot.
They didn't bring any shooters in.
Right.
Jaron Holmes was a 28% shooter for St. Bonaventure last year. Jeremiah Williams shot, I think, under 25 for Temple. You've got Ward and Osuni who aren't shooters. Trey King comes back after a year off, but he's only a 34% shooter. So you're relying on Kunk to be your primary shooter. Caleb Grill.
I didn't realize they were building a new stadium. That must be the reason they're trying to get all these bricks. Thank you for the dad joke. Yeah, I think Iowa State is fine. Again, that defense is going to be awesome, but I think they overachieved last year.
Yeah,
like they capitalized on opportunities, had a lot of breaks go their way. Quite frankly, teams have now seen Otzelberger's defense. in the Big 12 for a year. There's a year's worth of tape on it, and it won't look the same with Osuni back there. It'll be better, as scary as that is too. But it's not even like there's real obvious potential for somebody to break out offensively. Like that guy was Tyrese Hunter, and he is in Austin playing for the Longhorns now. So the fact that there is not even like a sliver of, well, this guy might step up for Iowa State offensively, I think could bode or lend itself to some disappointment, I think, for Iowa State fans.
Yeah, you lose Hunter. You also lose Isaiah Brockington, who,
right,
single-handedly shot them into wins in some games. So, I just don't trust, especially that perimeter. Right, you're looking at what a four guard rotation of Grill, Holmes, Kalsher, and Williams. And only one of them shoots over 30%. None of them shoot over 35%. Like, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough because once teams start packing it in on them, Osuni is going to have difficulty working because the perimeter can't score. So it's going to be interesting, to say the least.
Absolutely. Oklahoma State, a lot of people wrote them off just last season because of the fact they were eligible for the NCAA tournament. We could talk about the NCAA's way of handling infraction cases to our blue in the face, but we don't need to have that conversation again right now. It seems like that took a lot of life out of a team people had high hopes for last season, myself included. But they bring a good portion of that group back. I know Isaac Likely's gone. Defensively, they still should be really good. We were expecting some offensive breakouts last season from guys like Avery Anderson. That did not happen, but those guys are still there. That talent's still there, and there is a little bit more of a carrot out in front of them with the fact that they are eligible for the postseason now. So I wonder if that breakthrough is going to come this year. But again, the questions like Iowa State come from just the offensive end, and where is that going to come from? Yeah,
and they did go out and bring shooting in. John Michael Wright shot, I think, 37% at High Point. Caleb Asbury shot just under 40% at Texas State. Even Russell Harrison shot around 40% for Louisiana Monroe. So they went out and brought in shooting. Whether that can translate into the Big 12 in other aspects, shooting generally translates, but everything else about their game, whether they can stay on the floor because of it, is a question mark, because you're likely running three guys at the point. John Michael Wright and Asbury are joining. Avery Anderson will probably have the ball in his hands at the point a decent amount. Bryce Thompson, will need to step up at an even bigger rate. But, I mean, you talked about the bigs in this conference and some of the question marks we have about some of these teams at the 5 position. Like, I really like Moussa Cisse. And so...
Me too.
He is not going to be that takeover guy just because he's a 7-foot shot blocking center, but he can be a presence in the paint in a way that not a lot of teams in this conference, at least, jump off the page as having those.
He can average double digits just from lob catching and offensive rebounds. But to do that, you have to have perimeter threats to take some of that pressure off of him and force a defense to stretch out outside the paint. They didn't have that last year. So if you have Tompkins or Anderson or somebody else step up in the perimeter and take some of that attention away from him, I think we could see him blossom more offensively too, without his game really expanding a ton, just by product of him having more room to move and operate. Next two I want to talk about Oklahoma and West Virginia. Both of them were in the NCAA tournament conversation in February, but bad ends to the season kind of hurt them. West Virginia went out in the portal, added some major additions. Oklahoma did as well, bringing in Grant Sherfield from Nevada. I don't know what to make of these two right now. I think the way last season ended for each of them has lowered expectations a little bit. At the same time, if you want to be optimistic, you could say that the transfer additions significantly raised the ceilings. I don't think I fall in either one of those camps, But these two teams are in I think, as much in flux as any in the conference right now because of the new additions and also just how damn difficult the Big 12 is.
Yeah, I mean, Oklahoma lost quite a bit.
Right.
And they bring in Sherfield. They bring in Bamisile. I'm going to butcher his name, but the kid from George Washington. You know, they have, whereas others I have, questions about their shooting. I'm semi-confident in Oklahoma's offensive ability to score from the perimeter, take some of the pressure off the Groves. But at the same time, there are rumblings about Grant Sherfield that you can't ignore, and whether he is a winning point guard
or a good teammate.
Or a good teammate. Well, code for winning point guard.
Yes.
And you know, I trust Porter Moser to put together, you know, adequate defense, but I don't think they're going to be even probably in the top half of the conference in defense. So you're kind of in the middle spot in terms of both offense and defense, and that's not going to win you a ton of games in the Big 12 because you've got teams like Iowa State and Texas Tech that are going to be top 10, top 15 defenses in the country, and you've got teams like Kansas who's going to be pretty good, at least as a whole offensively, Baylor, and I trust some of the other teams offensively. They could be a top 40 defense and still be the worst defense perhaps in the conference or one of them. And I don't trust their offense to be much more than maybe sixth or seventh, fifth or sixth best in the conference. So it's tough. West Virginia is the opposite. I feel like people have learned to deal with the press a little bit more. But their offense, their lack of D1 experience, the pieces they have coming in, they're putting together a lot of new faces. They have talent, they have experience. They're going to start 5 seniors, but that's a lot of new pieces to fit together in a very short amount of time.
I'm interested to see how West Virginia will play because we've seen them go press. We've seen them go 2 bigs when they achieve Way and Culver. We've seen them Huggins go to basically every kind of style of play you could want, even going back to assignment Cincinnati. This team is relying on, I think, Trey Mitchell to be the Trey Mitchell he was at UMass, and people thought he was going to be at Texas, and on Joe Toussaint to step up. I always thought he flashed the ability to play in a bigger role than he did at Iowa. He's a very good defender. I think he has some offensive ability. Typically, at Iowa, you can get a lot out of somebody's offensive ability with just the system that McCaffrey runs there. Toussaint showed flashes to me, but was never consistent with it. He's going to have more of an opportunity at West Virginia, and hopefully they'll allow him to get downhill and attack more, which is, I think, where he's best. If he plays well and Mitchell plays well, I think West Virginia is a tournament team. I think this team will be okay. But, again, you're counting on 2 kind of inconsistent guys. Or guys who have been at least to this point in their careers on offense. Right.
And 3, really, because you're relying on Eric Stevenson to build off of his best season of his career, which it's sad that last year was the best season of his career, but it really was from a efficiency standpoint.
Eric Stevenson has been billed as a good shooter or offensive player at Wichita and at Washington and at South Carolina, and is a career 32% shooter.
30.5.
30.5, I'm sorry. So 4 seasons at 3 schools, it's not the system or the school. It's the player.
He 4 years, 2 seasons where he shot better than 30%. Last year he shot 33.3%, which was the best 3-point shooting season of his career.
Has he shot, I don't have it pulled up right now in front of me, has he shot over 40% from the field at any point in his career?
No, 32.5, 37.7, 35.7, 36.9 career, 35.9.
Not even from 3, just from the field. That is atrocious.
His 2-point shooting percentages are 41.5, 47, 41.7, 41.4.
For those keeping score at home, that's not good.
But he did shoot 98.4% from the free throw line last year.
There you go. He is.
Just send him out to
I
get
will give
fouled.
Stevenson. He is a solid defender, and I think he can provide things at times when he does not get trigger happy, but he gets trigger happy a lot.
Yep.
Which is why I say if West Virginia is going to be good, it's going to be on the backs of Toussaint and Mitchell offensively, because those are the two guys who I think they need and have shown the ability to do it. Oklahoma, you talked earlier about having that guy. I think Oklahoma's only saving grace this year will be if Grant Sherfield can be that guy, because he was at Nevada, and all the things about him off the court are certainly an issue. But if he comes into the Big 12 and maintains that level of play, he's going to be one of the best guards in the Big 12. And anytime you have that, you have something, particularly when they can score and create for themselves as well as Sherfield can. That, I think, is what Oklahoma is banking on, and then potentially moving up the standings this year, is Sherfield becoming a star. I don't know if that happens, but that's what they're banking on, and they have something potentially that very few teams in the conference have. That leaves us with Kansas State. First year of the Jerome Tang era. I think that we all love the hire. I think that hire was universally praised. Longtime Baylor assistant, getting his first-time head coach. He'd been with Scott Drew the entire time Scott Drew's been at Baylor as his lead assistant. So this is a guy who comes from winning pedigree. Now at a program that has been the worst of the Big 12 the last couple of years, just to put it bluntly. He has brought in some transfers, most notably Keontae Johnson from Florida. But that has its own sets of issues that we discussed on the podcast previously. I don't have high expectations for them.
No.
I think the season is about setting a foundation and building some positive momentum for Tang's tenure, because I think he'll be a good coach. And I think he will be someone we look up in 5 years, and he'll have Kansas State humming at a pretty good level. I know we got a question from Brady Vaughn about our thoughts on K-State as a whole this season. Not good. I would not – anything other than a last place finish would surprise me. But I do think this was the right hire, and we'll be having a different conversation in 2, 3, 4 years. But this year, even with the new additions, I don't think they'd have enough to match up.
Yeah, I mean, anything other than a last place finish really means that a team in the Oklahoma, Iowa State, West Virginia, Oklahoma State range had the wheels fall off pretty early on in conference play.
Yep.
Like you're relying on an undersized point guard. You're relying on some relatively unproven forwards and centers. I love the hire. I like the hire almost as much, if not more, than the Tommy Lloyd hire at Arizona. Tommy Lloyd inherited a team that didn't finish last in the conference.
Yeah.
And he inherited a team that had Benedict Mathurin and Christian Coloco and Tabellis. So, Tang doesn't have that luxury. But I do think what you will see this year is you'll see a team that plays clean basketball, a team that plays well together, and a team that flashes that at least the schemes are good, right? The talent might not be there. They might not get as much playing time out of Keontae Johnson as they would need to be competitive. But I think what you're going to see is you're going to see some flashes of some really good basketball from Kansas State, which I think is a win considering the spot they've been in over the last couple of years.
Absolutely. You want any sign of positivity moving forward. Because, again, this isn't just a last-place team we took over. It's a last-place team that then had pretty much their entire roster go to the transfer portal. So it is a legitimately full rebuild. Would have been different if some of those guys had stayed, particularly Nigel Pack. May have had a different conversation, but he's at Miami. Tang's taken over a team with a lot of question marks, to put it nicely.
Yep.
So as we move now to our projected standings, I think it's safe to say we both have Kansas State last.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So we can move on to the top where things are a little bit more interesting. I'll just go ahead and start. I think it's a 2-team race at the top between Kansas and Baylor. I will lean Baylor. We talked about it before. I just think they have more. They have more proven offensive weapons. Defensively, I think both teams will be good, but I think Baylor will be better. So I lean Baylor. I don't think they'll be as inconsistent as Kansas might be this year as some of those young guys get into the fold. So I'll lean Baylor at 1, and then I will slide Kansas in at 2. I think that's a clear tier, but I think Baylor is also the clear number 1.
Yeah, I have Baylor 1, Kansas 2. Not much of a gap, but I think there is a clear delineation between Baylor and Kansas for me, at least to start the season. And then after that, there's a moderate gap. I don't think it's huge because I think I have all 3 of the next 3 teams in that 11 to 20 range or somewhere in there. But there's a pretty clear gap for me between Baylor and Kansas in the next 3.
I agree. It feels sacrilegious to say Kansas second while I'm wearing this Kansas shirt, which I'm going to try and wear a team-themed shirt every time we do one of these. So if any schools are out there listening and want to send me a shirt, I will accept it. And I will talk nicely about your team, nicer than I just talked about Kansas not finishing in first. But behind them, I agree. I think there is a mini gap. I do think it's a clear top 2, but the gap in terms of level of play is not that far off. But I would put TCU third, ahead of Texas Tech and ahead of Texas. They're all top 20 teams for me. TCU, though, I have as my 12th best team in the country right now coming into the season. Texas, I have right outside top 15, and I have Texas Tech right at 20. So to me, it goes TCU, Texas at 4 in the Big 12, Texas Tech at 5. The offensive questions about Texas Tech concern me. I am buying into the TCU hype. I think anytime you have a guy like Mike Miles, your ceiling is you're going to hit your ceiling more often than not, or at least get closer to it. There is some variance here, but to me, looking into the season and what can be, I'm going TCU, Texas, Texas Tech.
I am sliding TCU to 4, Texas to 5, Texas Tech up to 3. In my top 25 rankings, I have Texas Tech, TCU right back to back, like literally right there. I'm playing to the known floor of Texas Tech more than the unknown ceiling of TCU there, I think a little bit. Texas Tech, I'm actually placing closer to their ceiling than their floor. TCU, I'm probably somewhere in the middle. Texas, I'm probably placing a little bit closer to their floor than their ceiling. Again, I really trust Mark Adams based on what he showed us last year. There was no drop-off in defense between Chris Beard and him. I can't get over what seemed like very clear, even if they weren't locker room issues, very clear on-court lack of chemistry from Texas last year during parts of the season that I don't think just go away by replacing their experienced guards with Tyrese Hunter. And then TCU I have in the middle. I think they can make a pretty sizable jump. They were borderline top 25 last year. They're, I think, pretty clearly in the top 15 this year.
So if there was a mini gap between the top 2 and these 3, is it safe to say there is a relative gulf between this top 5 and then the bottom half of the league?
Yes.
So to me, I think this is where things get interesting. So I'll let you start here. Who do you have as number 6?
Oklahoma State.
I do as well.
I think a lot of their issues, especially early on, had to do, we're talking, I believe they lost, it was Oakland they lost to last year, right? Mm-hmm. Pretty early on in the season. I think a lot of it was just, kind of they were giving what was the equivalent of like a tranq dart by the NCAA in determining that they were no longer eligible. And they started playing well. They started playing spoiler in the Big 12, which is where but once you stop playing well, it's really tough to get back on that train, especially when you're not a team with the talent of like a Kansas or a Baylor. But I really like what they have this year. They do lose likely, but I think they've got some pretty good talent to put them at number 6.
Yeah, I think they're a tournament team. I think the top 5 all have at least Sweet 16 potential. I don't have that with Oklahoma State, but I do think they're a tournament team. I think defensively they'll be really, really solid. If they can get just a little bit more at a Thompson or Anderson on the perimeter, I think we have a different conversation about them, and they're potentially a borderline top 25 team. We'll see how that unfolds, but I do like that at number 6. Number 7 for me, this might be high. I'm curious to get your take. 7th, I have West Virginia. Just because I think we will get a good amount of Toussaint and Mitchell, at least a good amount of production from them, that'll have them at least in the NCAA tournament conversation, in the bubble mix. I would probably lean them on more towards the inside than the outside right now, but that might be as a double-digit seed.
Yeah, I have West Virginia 8. I actually have Oklahoma at 7.
Okay.
I really like the offense from Oklahoma, and I think of the teams at the bottom, their offense is one that I can trust more than the others to score on a consistent basis. I understand where they finished last year, but every team behind these 6 that we've named all finished low in the standings last year. I like Porter Moser, but again, I think those 2 back-to-back for me, Oklahoma, I'm higher on, I know, than a lot of people, and then West Virginia at 8.
So I have Oklahoma 9th, and I'm sliding Iowa State 8th. Okay. Iowa State fans are going to hate us for having them so low, but where's your offense going to come from? Like that to me, I don't think they finish higher than 7th just because I don't think the offense is going to be there for this team. It feels wrong having a Porter Moser coach team 9th in any league, but I do think there's a scenario here where the locker room blows up as much as any Porter Moser locker room can because he's a really good locker room guy, good culture guy. I do think that blows up a little bit more with Sherfield there, potentially, and there's not a ton outside of him and the Groveses. I think they can still be a very good team. This will be a team kind of like last year with West Virginia and Oklahoma, where there's talk about them potentially being in the tournament with a big win or two once we get to February. Part of that's just how deep the Big 12 is. But they're a team that's good, but are going to get eaten up in the Big 12 with how good the Big 12 is.
Yeah.
That's got to be some team. To me, it's Oklahoma.
Yeah. No, I mean, I could definitely see that. For me, it was, I feel like Oklahoma on paper got better, and I trust Moser more than I trust previous coaches for Grant Sherfield to rein Sherfield in. They got better. They tied with Iowa State last year, who I think is taking a step back. Don't forget, Iowa State finished 7th, tied for 7th in the Big 12 last year. A lot of that had to do with their offense, which is getting significantly worse. I don't know if their defense might take a step forward. It might stay the same. It might get worse. But I think their offense, they don't have a Tyrese Hunter, Isaiah Brockington duo that can save them offensively.
I can tell you I hate that I have Iowa State ahead of Oklahoma. It's not something I feel comfortable with just because of Porter Moser. But I also think we need to give Otzelberger some credit for what happened last year. And I think they'll figure something out. Whether they play every game in the 40s, I don't know. Maybe they do. But that's the way I look at it right now. I'm probably going to be kicking myself for that once we get into conference play. But we'll see. And then, obviously, Kansas State 10th. Before we get out of here, we do want to give our all-conference selections. We'll each give our top 5 guys in the league. And then we're not leaving without a bold prediction. So we'll start, though, Connor. Give me your first team all Big 12. Who do you have?
As much as we said that he wasn't the guy, I feel like Jalen Wilson's going to be the best player for Kansas. So I'll have Wilson. I'll have Flagler from Baylor. I just think he's going to have the ball in his hands too much for a top team to not be there. Mike Miles from TCU. Give me Marcus Carr from Texas. And I'm deciding in my head between two players. I'm going to go Keontae George. I think the freshman does it and makes the first team.
I think each one of those top 5 teams we mentioned gets one guy on the list. Backcourt, Mike Miles, TCU, pretty easy, done, check. Keontae George, Baylor, pretty easy, done, check. I'm going to put Marcus Carr on there too, Texas. I'm still holding out hope that what I thought we were going to get last year, we're going to get this year with a little bit more buy-in from him. Hopefully Beard understands how to utilize him a little bit more. There's some more synergy there. I think we might see some more out of him. I'm going to put Jalen Wilson there too. Again, not totally confident in him becoming that guy, kind of like you said, but Kansas might have to default to him being that guy, and the leading scorer on Kansas is going to be a first-team all-conference player, with how good Kansas projects to be anyway. So I put him on the list. And then I'll put Kevin O'Banner on from Texas Tech. It took him about half the season to get his feet underneath him, going from Oral Roberts to Texas Tech. But the last half of the season, he was really, really good. He was one of, if not the best Texas Tech player on the offensive end of the court. Defensively, he was fine, and it maybe took him a while to build up on that end to where Mark Adams trusted him to play him enough minutes. But he got his pick-and-pop game going, and he was really, really good down the stretch. And I know there's a little bit more competition for shots this year in that front court with Texas Tech, but he did fine playing next to Bryson Williams last year. I think he becomes Texas Tech's go-to guy. Put him first team all conference as well. That might be something of a bold prediction. I don't view it that way. But before we get out of here, Connor, bold prediction for the Big 12. What's going to happen?
Oh, geez. You go first. I'm still thinking if this is bold enough.
Yeah. I'm deciding between a couple here in terms of what I think is the most bold. Okay. Mike Miles wins Player of the Year in the conference. I think there won't be that guy from Kansas. I think there will be too many Baylor options. And I think Miles will become that clear guy on a TSU team that finishes third. And so he wins the award.
Okay. I was going to go with a Player of the Year, so I'll just do that as well for my bold prediction.
Bring it.
And it might not be bold, but I think it is because I haven't heard a lot of people hyping him up this much. I think Adam Flagler ends up winning Big 12 Player of the Year. I think he's going to have the ball in his hands a ton on Baylor. He is a very efficient scorer, very efficient distributor. And I just, you've got Cryer and Keontae George that are going to take pressure off of him. But I think that there is going to be a clear Baylor championship in the Big 12. And because of that, I'm looking at Baylor more than a Jalen Wilson or Mike. I had considered Mike Miles for Jalen Wilson and Mike Miles as like the top two choices. But I think Flagler sneaks in there and kind of takes it by storm now that he doesn't have a Kinjo or someone else taking away his ability to be ball dominant.
I think that's fair. My only pushback would be if he, and there's a chance he breaks out this year, but I think if he was that good ball dominant, that he would have been more ball dominant before now.
But you're talking about teams like 2 years ago where you had the three guards that were the best backcourt in the country.
Correct.
And last year where you had a Kinjo where Kinjo only works when he's ball dominant, and Flagler does work off ball. I think Flagler stepping into the primary point guard position breaks out and becomes Player of the Year.
That is fair. That's why you listen to Heat Check Hangout, for Connor saying really smart things like that can change your mind. Okay, it's fine. Disregard that last part. Well, that'll do it for our first conference preview of the season. Thank you all very much for listening and watching if you're watching on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. Subscribe, rate, review, all that good stuff. you're listening on the podcast, do them both. You can consume us video or audio. Do both. It's fine. We accept it all. Help us grow, again, as we're trying to grow the Hangout. So my co-host, Connor Hope, I'm Brian Rauf. Thank you guys very much for listening or watching, and we'll talk to you again next time.
Basketball, basketball, college. Basketball, basketball, college. Oh, is that time already? Whoa, basketball, college. Come on. Basketball, basketball, college. Basketball, basketball, college. Whoa, basketball, college.